Hello everyone, my name is Kieran Saunders and I'm excited to be your host for today's Deploying My Custom App webinar. We'll be covering some of the material or at least taking some inspiration from the Deploy Your Custom App Success Guide, giving you some tips around the pros and cons of different ways of getting your custom app deployed to either your internal or your external partners. So today I have the pleasure of having Ben Fletcher from DataTherapy, one of our platinum partners. They're not only fantastic developers, they're also one of our go-to companies for hosting, for getting your file out there in the cloud. So just some sort of housekeeping things to go on. One is if you're experiencing any issues hearing me or seeing the screen, then please go boot up a browser and go to help.citrix.com, contact us and see if they can quickly help you during the presentation. We're recording this, so that will be posted as well, and you can watch this offline in the future as soon as we get that uploaded. So I'll be, in a minute, I'll be handing over to Ben and he'll be taking you through the presentation and the demo. But if during the presentation you've got some questions, please, if you could use the GoToMeeting control panel as shown here in the picture. I'll be online still, I'll be nudging you and answering those questions when I can. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go live, and either if you haven't got a mic, I'll be asking your questions on your behalf to Ben. Or if you can and you're in a quiet environment, we'll bring you on and bring you on live, and you can have a quick chat to Ben around the subject. So let's get started then. So hopefully you've seen one of the three guides that we've produced and been sharing with our customers in the last few months. And of course, it's around the journey, the big picture of how you start off your journey creating a custom app. So you're starting off with number one, of course, is planning. It's so important. It's a really worthwhile way to start, of course. We did a webinar around that, so it's worth going and looking at the recording of that webinar, how you get started with planning a custom app. Of course, number two is how you create your custom app, and that webinar is actually coming. So look out for that one, how to create your app, and some good tips around that. And after you finish creating your app, or when you want to just do a technology test, how do you deploy, how do you get it into the hands of users is today's webinar. So if you're just a bit visual, here's what the plans look like. They're really beautifully made, great information, like I say, within them, and hopefully today's webinar will be building upon that knowledge and giving you much more sort of expert tips from the expert, as it was. And there's a URL there at the bottom, so you can go, and if you haven't already, you can go and re-download those right now. So that's FileMaker.com and Custom Apps Guides. Okay, so without any other delay, I'd like to hand over to Ben, and take it away, Ben.
So thank you for the introduction there, Kieran. So just by way of introduction, just a bit of background about me. I'm one of the directors at DataTherapy. I'm responsible for heading up the custom app development team. I have, for my sins, a PhD and BSc in genetics. I'm a certified FileMaker developer, and I've been using the platform for over 12 years. As a little bit of a background to who DataTherapy are and what we do, we offer bespoke software development services, and we have a specialist experience in FileMaker cloud hosting. We've got a team of 16 people, and we're based in London, just near King's Cross. We've been FileMaker Platinum partners for 15 years now, and we've got a team of 6 certified developers, including myself. Just to give you an idea of the range of clients we have, we've got very diverse industry experience with people involved in education, NHS, food retail, and consulting services. And this just really gives you a bit of an idea that we've seen lots of very different, very diverse challenges with deploying custom apps. So this is really a bit of a high-level overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So broadly, we're just going to run through what is deployment, how to access your app, determine an appropriate deployment strategy based on what you're intending to do with your custom app. We'll run through with a little demo of how FileMaker Server works, and then just really discuss from a high-level point of view what you should be doing in terms of backup and disaster recovery. So what is deployment? So put very simply, deployment is simply the process of making your custom app available to the rest of your team or your organization. And it's also associated with the infrastructure that you need for that deployment. So just to run through then, you've probably got your copy of FileMaker Pro, FileMaker Advanced. You've gone through the process of discovery and initial development and planning. You've built your app. You're at the point now where really you want to roll it out for wider testing within your organization or to actually put it live. So fundamentally, this is just to really highlight that this is the key thing, is you're sharing what was something you've built as an individual to a team. So those people could be collecting using FileMaker Pro, using desktop or laptop, Macs or PCs. They could be using iOS devices, so an iPhone or an iPad using the FileMaker Go client, or you might be pushing it out to access via the web, and then there could be a whole range of devices that are accessing it from Macs, PCs, iOS devices, or even Android devices running Chrome, for example. So the big question then is, well, how do you share your app across this diverse range of users and devices? And the key to this is really FileMaker Server, which is the linchpin of the FileMaker platform, which allows you to share your custom app across all these classes of users and devices. So essentially, you take your custom app file and you deploy it to your FileMaker Server, and then from that, you can then make it available, and your users can access that.
I quickly make a point, Ben. Just in a past webinar, I've had the question, I just thought I'd bring it up straight away, is that the FileMaker Server part, that's not hardware we're talking about right there, are we? We're talking about FileMaker Server as the software.
No, this is a piece of software which runs on your server hardware, essentially. Yeah, that's correct. So the thing that is worth mentioning is there's not just one option for deploying your FileMaker Server. There's actually a couple of options now, and interestingly enough, if you've looked at the FileMaker website over the last couple of days, this has all changed. So traditionally, third-party cloud hosting provider like ourselves would be the default option for many people. Acceptability of cloud has really risen over the last few years as more people have got used to wanting to accessing things on mobile devices and went out of a standard kind of office environment. Literally, as of this week, we've had a big announcement from FileMaker in the form of FileMaker Cloud. So that's a very new and very different way of deploying your FileMaker Server using Amazon's EC infrastructure, which is a very flexible and scalable platform. The one thing just to highlight there is perhaps that to our European audience is that this is technically only really available in the US and North America at the moment. And then the traditional route, which would have been standard maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago, and which older FileMaker customers might be used to, which is the on-premises server. So that's a physical box running in your own office or in some sort of a remote office that you might be associated with, for example. So then all we're going to do now is just run through some of the pros and cons of all these different approaches. So with a cloud hosting provider like ourselves, there's no upfront investment in the hardware. So the key thing is you're not having to spend a large amount of money just to get going, which is a big boon to a lot of people. And it's also then going to be hosted in a specialist data center. I mean, there's a lot of key things that are big advantages to that. You're not necessarily responsible for worrying about redundant power. You're not responsible for wondering about redundant connectivity. It's security as well is usually standard and very regimented, and people usually have specialist expertise that they've allocated for that particular data center. It's also worth mentioning that it is usually a fixed fee, so you know exactly what you're paying on a month-by-month, year-by-year basis, which is very important to a lot of people. The one thing that is worth just highlighting with cloud hosting, which actually really applies to all these scenarios to an extent, but is the most obvious from a hosting point of view, is that it's highly dependent upon the speed and quality of your internet connection, because ultimately that usually becomes the performance limiting step and the bottleneck. Then just really talk a little bit about FileMaker Cloud. I mean, could probably warrant its own webinar in its own right now. Again, there's no upfront investment in the hardware, which is a big deal to a lot of people, and it's probably by far the most flexible option available. I mean, FileMaker Cloud offers by-the-hour pricing, which is by the minute, yeah, indeed. And also then, of course, you can very quickly switch from one particular performance package to another and flexibly increment your storage and so on and so forth. But again, as we said, it's worth just calling out here with FileMaker Cloud. It is exceptionally intimidating if you're new to the whole cloud hosting sphere, if it's not a core expertise you already have. It's also worth mentioning that it is a very new and different product from standard FileMaker Server that traditional users of FileMaker will have got used to, and not all of the features are fully supported yet. And then finally, just from worth highlighting from a kind of availability point of view, it's not officially supported in yet. You can register and use one of the US hosted servers, but that can potentially create problems in its own right in terms of data compliance, because in Europe we have some very strict legislation in relation to that. So then finally, just to go back again and then highlight, people can host also on premises. I mean, this would have been your default option maybe 5 or 6 years ago. It tends to be relatively rare these days. There are a couple of cons. If you have, obviously, if you have existing hardware in place that you can leverage, then obviously this potentially is a very economic option. It's worth highlighting. Also, some organizations have exceptionally complex security, performance, or storage requirements, which can be very hard for a cloud provider to meet. It's not to say it can't be done, but if you've already got that infrastructure in place, then there's a good argument from a cost-benefit point of view to just leveraging that and making use of it. Just to highlight again why on-premises has really fallen out of favor over the last couple of years, and the main one is the upfront cost. If you haven't already got dedicated hardware available, you have to pony up all the money for that upfront. Again, if you don't already have in-house support experience of managing servers or FileMaker Server in particular, then you may have to contract that in, get a third party to do it for you. And again, if you've never had to worry about this kind of infrastructure before, you do need to sort out your off-site backup and some sort of disaster recovery arrangements for if the hardware fails. I mean, one thing that is worth highlighting again is if you are still pushing this out to remote offices or home workers or remote people accessing the system, you're also going to need to upgrade your connectivity again. The only case where you're not going to is if you have a pretty closed system which everyone's just accessing from one main office. And again, that would be very common 5 or 6 years ago, but it's actually a relatively rare scenario in modern terms. So all we're going to do is give you a little bit of a quick demo of how you go about uploading your file to FileMaker Server. And just if you want to play along at home, you can actually access the demo server that we've set up by just going to webinar.filemaker.link. It should auto force you onto a secure HTTPS connection, and you can try and log in now and just look as and when we've got the file uploaded. So if you haven't seen it before, I'm just going to open up a very simple file that I built this morning using FileMaker Pro, and it's really just to demonstrate the concept of how quickly something can be deployed using FileMaker. So this is just a very simple database. It's just essentially an area of interest form that you might want to fill in. So just a couple of things to highlight is once you've created your custom app, you definitely want to go through and look at the security settings. The first thing you want to do is, and just you probably noticed if you've started to look at the security settings available in FileMaker, by default usually you'll find that there's a single admin account with a blank password. You definitely want to change that if you're going to host anything. Okay. The next thing you want to do then is set up your users if you have full access or developer users, and set up any standard users that you want to access the system, and go through the privilege sets and limit what they can do. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just one key thing to highlight is once you have set up users and privilege sets, the key thing is you want to enable the services by which you want someone to be able to access the file. So the most common ones that we're going to want to pay attention to is this one here, access via FileMaker Network. That means people can access using FileMaker Pro and FileMaker Go. And the other one then is to access via FileMaker Web Direct. Okay. So essentially, once you've done that, then you can then look at uploading the file to your server. So you can use this using FileMaker Pro or FileMaker Advanced, and essentially you go to Sharing, Upload to FileMaker Server. If you've got the file open, it'll just warn you that it's going to close the file, and you're presented with this upload dialog box. Okay, so I put in the address of our demo server. I've then saved in my keychain the administrator login and password in order to log in, and just select Next. Okay, so because I had the file open, it's auto-picked that for me, but I could instead choose Browse and pick the file on my desktop. Okay, it says that the file's ready to be uploaded. I click on Upload, and this is a pretty small file, so it shouldn't take very long to upload at all. Okay, so it's now successfully uploaded to the server, and by default, I've just been presented with this option to open it in FileMaker Pro automatically. So I'm going to click Done now, and then FileMaker Pro is going to prompt me to put my login and password. And I'm into the file. The point to note here is that when I'm accessing via the server, it's actually giving me the server name here just to indicate that I'm accessing then a hosted solution rather than something that's just running locally upon my machine. So all I'm going to do now is just minimize that and then just hop over to my web browser just to show you that file has now been hosted. So again, you can play along from home here if you just want to go to webinar.filemaker.link, and I'm just going to refresh my page, and I can see now that my demo file has been hosted on the server. I'm just going to click onto it. Because I've set the file up with guest account access, anyone can just log into the guest account. And there you go. I've effectively got a web accessible via Web Direct copy of my form. I can then effectively just fill in the form, and you're welcome to again follow along at home just to show there's no smoke and mirrors here. I'm just going to submit that, and that's just created a record essentially in the back end of the database file. So I'm just going to close that connection now. So what's worth doing now is just logging on to the server just so you can see what's going on in the back end. And again, you would effectively go to your server address, and this port 16,000, which is basically the default FileMaker admin console port, and I'm just going to log into the back end. So I'm just going to quickly run through some of the things that you're going to see on FileMaker Server, because this will be unfamiliar, I presume, to most of the audience unless they've already had some experience of deploying on FileMaker Server. So you get essentially a status page. This confirms the address to the server, what log events have occurred recently, how many clients the server's licensed for, whether the web server's active, whether the web publishing engine is active, and whether ODBC, JDBC connectivity is live. Okay, these are all just different methods by which you can access data on the server and confirming what's active. If we go over to activity, this summarizes the databases that I have on the server. So I can see my FM webinar demo file, and I can see how many people I've got connected. So there you go, 10 of you have connected, including my machine here. Again, you can see also then the status of the file, it's open, what connectivity has been enabled on the file, and there's options here to basically open and close the files and remove them from the server if necessary. So if I then wanted to close this file or to do some form of maintenance work, I could just select the file and click on Close, for example. So the other area that's worth highlighting is, again, you can see the list of all the people that have currently connected to the server. Again, useful if you do need to do maintenance work. What you want to do is make sure that you send a message to people using the server that you're doing that work rather than just dropping everyone's connection, especially if it's moved into a production use. Okay, so that's a very just simple overview. There's then an area where you can configure schedules. So commonly what you want to do is configure backup scripts to occur at particular times. You might also then have some server-side scripts that you need to run to do some maintenance or email alerts and things like that. That can all be configured from the schedules area. You can also then toggle whether a schedule is enabled or not, and then re-edit the script as necessary. Okay. The statistics and logging areas are really just places that collect detailed information about your FileMaker server. So I won't really go through this in detail because this isn't a real server and I haven't really got much information in terms of the stats. But essentially you can log, yeah, we'll just show the statistics up here and just toggle some of those on for you. And they're just giving you metrics about the server performance. So again, at some point you're probably going to find that as you add more users and your database files get slower, you might get your users reporting certain performance issues. And there's lots of tuning that you can potentially do in terms of your network performance, the amount of RAM, the processing on the machine. And the important thing is really just to establish what bottlenecks are causing your apps to slow down. And there's an awful lot of information that FileMaker Server provides to do that. Just in terms of general configuration and settings, just to give you a very high-level overview of what's available here, you can ultimately configure what the name of the server is called, the description you get in the admin console when someone attempts to log in, and you can update your licensing information. So, for example, if you add additional concurrencies to your server so that additional users can connect to the server, you can configure email alerts. So, for example, if you have someone who's responsible for monitoring the server in-house, you may want to get alerts to confirm that backups have successfully executed and so on and so forth. And you can also then turn on various administrative services such as administrator groups if you want to delegate out responsibility for managing certain files to different team leaders, for example, or different members of the IT department. The database server section is the kind of crunchy section. This has the thing that ultimately configures basically the performance and the way that your server is configured to back up. So just a very high-level overview of this. There is you can specify a limit to how many connections you want to the actual server. You can also then specify how many files you want to host on the server. It is worth highlighting there is an absolute limit of 125 files that can be hosted on the server. There are a couple of different security settings which is worth just running through here. The first is, in most cases, if you are going to expose something to the public internet, you want to make sure that you purchase an appropriate SSL certificate to ensure that your connection is encrypted. And again, there's an area here that allows you to import those certificates. You can also add an additional level of security, which we often recommend for publicly hosted files, which is that you can cause what's a form of double authentication so that no one's allowed to see what files are actually on the server without authenticating first. So if you have a number of different users, some of which are granted with access to different files, it's a good additional sort of level of protection to add. Another thing that's worth highlighting is if you are deploying on an internal on-premises network, you can set up FileMaker Server to authenticate via Active Directory and Open Directory, and this is where you would enable that option. Final area that's just worth highlighting is the web publishing section, which just configures whether or not the web publishing engine is used, whether FileMaker PHP publishing is used, XML, and WebDirect. And the one that's kind of pertinent to this demo is just really the WebDirect one. Okay. So that really covers the core features that are available in FileMaker Server. So it's worth just then running through a couple of considerations. FileMaker do on their website have very detailed specifications of what they regard as the minimum and recommended configurations for running a FileMaker server. A key thing that is often highlighted to people is that we really do recommend having a dedicated virtual or physical piece of hardware that's used as a FileMaker server. What commonly happens with people is there's this tendency to want to put FileMaker server on top of an existing server, which if it's already overloaded, then effectively you can end up having a bad performance experience, not because there's a problem with FileMaker Server, because the server's already doing a lot of other work. So do consider a dedicated physical virtual server for your FileMaker Server. As we alluded to earlier, when sort of weighing up the pros and cons of the various deployment scenarios and options, internet network performance is usually the major bottleneck. If you do decide that you're not using third-party hosting provider, then you may need to look at upgrading your internet backbone, because all your external users or remote office users are fundamentally going to be using that to access the database. Again, another thing just to run through is FileMaker has several ways of handling authentication. People are used to, when they first build their file, adding local FileMaker users and accounts to the file, usually for developers. But you can, of course, enable external authentication and get authentication via Open or Active Directory. And that's a common thing that's for on-premises. Again, just in terms of security, again, I highlighted that you definitely want, if you're going to publicly expose yourself to the internet, to ensure that you've got an appropriate SSL certificate configured. And there have been quite a few public issues associated, which highlighted that, like the Heartbleed SSL bug a couple of years ago, that highlighted the need to make sure that your security is up to date and so on and so forth. And then the other thing is, that's again worth highlighting about FileMaker Pro, is ignoring the security of your network. People commonly want to now encrypt the database actually on the server. So in the hopefully unlikely event that your server is ever compromised, the data on the server is encrypted. So without those encryption keys, even if someone managed to copy all of your database files off of the server, they wouldn't actually be able to do anything with them without those keys. Again, to highlight then that you should have a backup strategy. One of the advantages of cloud hosting providers is usually they include some sort of backup standard. But you can, of course, configure scheduled backups on your FileMaker server for particular timed intervals. Again, we commonly recommend to people that they should be thinking as a minimum to have a rolling 7-day backup. So if they do notice any issues with, they can revert to at least something that's in the last couple of days, or check the last couple of backups to see when an issue might have cropped up. As 9 times out of 10, it's a user that's actually deleted data, which is the issue. Another thing that's worth mentioning is FileMaker Server does now support the concept of progressive backups. These are often thought of as delta backups. So rather than a backup occurring of the entire file at a particular scheduled time, FileMaker can be configured after a certain number of minutes to incrementally update. So you can have a very recent backup always available. In fact, if you've got multiple servers available, you can, of course, then configure the second server to act as a failover server potentially as well. And then again, another thing to highlight, everyone thinks about configuring backups on the server itself, but it's worth just highlighting that you need to make sure you then ultimately get those backup dumps off of your FileMaker server and onto some other physical bit of hardware. And that may be in turn a different cloud-hosted backup service, or it might be a different physical infrastructure in or out of your office. I mean, we commonly do kind of highlight to people one of the dangers of on-premises is people like to talk with a lot of enthusiasm about all their due diligence and processes that they've got, but if all their backups are ultimately the same office and the same office burns down or is not available due to some other disaster, then obviously you're going to lose access to all your data. So you need to make sure that you have a robust backup that is off-site from wherever your main server is located.
Just one point, Ben, on that as well. Just everything you said was absolutely spot on. The other thing that always interests me as well is that I've heard horror stories where people have got all these wonderful backup strategies in place, and yet they have never tested the backup that it works. You know, they've never done a test of a controlled rollback just to see whether it actually does work. So that's just the last piece of the pie, is have all these things in place, but then please check your backups are right. You know, are you doing it correct? You know, that's just the last piece of the puzzle that unfortunately some people just don't seem to get to, that last sort of test.
That's a really important point. It's well worth highlighting. And then the flip side to that is backup is not disaster recovery. As we were saying, even if you've got a backup, if it's going to take you hours to restore that backup because you've decided to back up to some remote location and it's still limited by the rate of your internet connection, you may end up with gigabytes of database file. It might take you days to actually recover that. You may have another fully available server that you can copy your data to, but if you've not, for example, set up a failover server and got a progressive backup in place, you might be looking at hours or days to copy the data back. So therefore, you're going to be offline for that period. And just to really highlight then all the things that we've kind of covered, you will need a FileMaker server if you want to share your file with the rest of your team. You also need FileMaker Pro licensing to cover the people who are going to be accessing with your desktop or laptop, Macs and PCs. Your FileMaker Go and your WebDirect, though, is handled usually with concurrency licensing. Now, all the things I've just mentioned is really a bit of a legacy licensing option. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that FileMaker now offers with 15 a very flexible licensing model called FileMaker for Teams. Now, the big advantage of FileMaker for Teams is you really don't need to worry what type of devices people are going to be using. You can mix and match your concurrencies between FileMaker Pro, FileMaker Go, and WebDirect, and you can swap between the devices as you see fit. So it's a very, very flexible arrangement. The only downside, and there is a small downside that's just worth mentioning, is if people do have scenarios where they need some sort of offline sync solution for FileMaker Pro, then the FileMaker Legacy licensing is still the appropriate option to go, because FileMaker for Teams relies upon you constantly being connected to your FileMaker server. Or yes, that's the other option, is you could of course purchase a single copy of FileMaker Advanced for if you've just got a couple of small development or use cases where you need offline access to FileMaker. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we are hosting providers, and we've got a lot of experience of FileMaker best practice in terms of hosting, and it's worth just highlighting that some deployment solutions are solved with slightly smarter hosting, and some are best solved with slightly smarter development. And because we've got a dedicated infrastructure and consulting and development team, we're quite comfortable giving you both bits of information in order to optimize your deployment. We do have an exclusive offer for anyone who's on this webinar, which is normally we offer a free hosting trial of any of our services. You're very welcome to contact us and arrange for that. On top of that, people can have some quite challenging security or performance requirements that might really require a bit of discussion around the pros and cons. And again, because we have a dedicated consulting team and an infrastructure team, we're usually quite upfront about giving you the pros and cons of each approach, and in some cases, if the best solution may be that you have to deploy something on premises, and we're very happy to help you set up that. And those are my details. Very happy for you to call me, very happy for you to email me anytime.